The September afternoon cast golden light across the cobbled yard of Hollow Tree Farm, where the annual Apple Harvest Festival had drawn nearly every soul from the village of Little Wickham. Bunting fluttered between the ancient oak from which the farm took its name, its hollow trunk standing sentinel over tables laden with prize-winning preserves, russet apples, and the season's finest cider. The air carried the mingled scents of fresh bread, wood smoke, and the last roses climbing the farmhouse walls. Miss Jane Marple sat contentedly on a wooden bench near the cider press, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she observed the familiar tableau of village life. Her keen blue eyes, though gentle in appearance, missed nothing of the human drama unfolding before her. She had learned long ago that festivals, like funerals, revealed people as they truly were beneath their carefully maintained facades. Thomas Grayling, the farm's prosperous owner, commanded attention in his best tweed jacket as he prepared to judge the annual apple tart competition. His wife, Margaret, stood beside him with the practiced smile of someone accustomed to public scrutiny, though Miss Marple noticed the slight tension around her eyes. Their son Peter hovered nearby, his face bearing the sullen expression she recognized in those who felt perpetually overshadowed by a domineering parent. Dr. Sarah Fleming approached the judging table with professional interest, her dark hair severely pulled back, and her manner as crisp as her reputation suggested. As the village's newest resident, she had quickly established herself as both competent and somewhat mysterious. Miss Marple had heard whispers about the doctor's frequent visits to Hollow Tree Farm, ostensibly professional, but perhaps something more. Owen Pritchard, the farm's hired man, moved between the stalls with barely concealed resentment. His weathered hands clenched whenever someone praised the Grayling prosperity, and Miss Marple observed how his gaze lingered on the farmhouse with unmistakable longing. Village gossip suggested Owen had once courted Margaret before Thomas's wealth had won her hand 30 years ago. Mrs. Dorothy Pembroke bustled about with her clipboard, directing volunteers with the enthusiasm of a general commanding troops. Her sharp voice carried across the yard as she corrected arrangements, and Miss Marple noted how people instinctively stepped aside when they saw her approaching. Even Reverend Timothy Ashworth seemed unusually troubled today, his normally serene expression clouded as he spoke in hushed tones with several parishioners. The competition commenced with ceremonious gravity. Thomas Grayling took his place at the judging table, flanked by Dr. Fleming and Mrs. Pembroke. He made a brief speech containing the words tradition, standards, and community values, though his tone suggested these were obligations rather than pleasures. The assembled crowd watched with the mixture of anticipation and anxiety that accompanied all village competitions. The first 3 tarts received Thomas's typically measured responses: adequate, ambitious but flawed, and traditional, though uninspired. Miss Marple observed not Thomas's reactions but those of the watchers. Margaret's white-knuckled grip on her handbag, Peter's nervous glances toward the hollow oak, Owen's jaw working though he chewed nothing. The 4th tart, decorated with an intricate lattice pattern, drew Thomas's particular attention. "Interesting technique," he pronounced, cutting a generous portion. Miss Marple noticed Dr. Fleming's slight frown as she watched him taste it, her medical training perhaps detecting something others missed. Thomas paused mid-chew, his expression shifting from critical assessment to confusion, then alarm. His hand moved to his throat as his face flushed an alarming shade of red. The silver fork clattered against the china plate as he gasped for air, his eyes wide with sudden understanding and terror. The cheerful murmur of the crowd died as Thomas Grayling collapsed backward, his chair overturning with a crash that seemed to echo across the suddenly silent farmyard. Dr. Fleming rushed forward, but even from her distant bench, Miss Marple could see it was far too late. The Apple Harvest Festival had become something far more sinister, and the peaceful village of Little Wickham would never be quite the same. The silence that followed Thomas Grayling's collapse lasted mere seconds before chaos erupted across the farmyard. Dr. Fleming moved with practiced efficiency, dropping to her knees beside the fallen man, her fingers seeking the pulse at his throat while her other hand checked for breathing. The festive chatter died instantly, replaced by gasps and frightened whispers as the reality of the situation settled over the gathered villagers like a suffocating blanket. "Please step back, everyone," Dr. Fleming commanded, her voice carrying the authority of medical training. "Give him space." But even as she spoke, her examination confirmed what her instincts had already told her. Thomas Grayling's pupils were fixed and dilated, his skin bearing an unnatural flush that spoke of something far more sinister than natural causes. After a long moment, she rose slowly, her face grave. "I'm afraid he's gone. This appears to be a case of poisoning." The word poisoning rippled through the crowd like wildfire, transforming neighbors into potential suspects in an instant. Margaret Grayling pushed through the gathering, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking as she saw her husband's motionless form. "Thomas! Oh, Thomas!" Her wail pierced the afternoon air, sending children clinging to their mothers' skirts and causing several elderly villagers to cross themselves instinctively. Peter Grayling appeared at his mother's side, his face pale beneath his harvest tan, though Miss Marple noted with interest that his hands remained remarkably steady as he guided Margaret away from the body. Owen Pritchard stood frozen near the cider press, his weathered features unreadable, though something flickered in his eyes that might have been satisfaction before he quickly masked it with appropriate grief. Mrs. Pembroke, her clipboard clutched against her chest like armor, began issuing orders with trembling authority. No one must leave the premises until the police arrive, and nobody, absolutely nobody, is to touch anything on that judging table. Her gaze fixed on the lattice-decorated tart that had proven so fatal, its innocent appearance now seeming almost mocking. Within minutes, the sound of approaching sirens cut through the autumn air. Constable Hemlock arrived first, his young face flushed with exertion and obvious bewilderment at finding himself confronted with actual crime. He was quickly followed by Inspector Craddock from the county town, a compact man with shrewd eyes who took command of the scene with quiet efficiency. "Nobody touches anything," Inspector Craddock announced, his gaze sweeping the assembled crowd. "Dr. Fleming, I'll need your preliminary assessment. The rest of you, please remain where you are while we secure the area." The village buzzed with nervous energy as speculation began in earnest. Mrs. Gibbs, the postmistress, was heard declaring loudly that Owen Pritchard had finally snapped after 30 years of nursing grudges. Others whispered about Thomas's ruthless business dealings and the enemies he'd made with his aggressive land acquisitions. Even the Grayling family dynamics came under scrutiny, with knowing glances cast toward Peter's obvious relief at his father's domineering presence being permanently removed. Reverend Ashworth moved through the crowd offering comfort, though his usual serenity seemed forced, and Miss Marple observed his repeated, anxious glances toward the hollow oak tree. Dr. Fleming worked methodically to preserve the crime scene, covering the remaining tarts and making careful notes in her leather journal. Miss Marple remained seated on her bench throughout the commotion, her knitting forgotten in her lap as she catalogued every reaction, every telling glance, every nervous gesture. She had learned long ago that truth revealed itself not in what people said, but in what they did when they believed themselves unobserved. The real investigation was about to begin, and she intended to be perfectly positioned to observe the human drama that would inevitably unfold. The golden afternoon light was fading now, casting long shadows across Hollow Tree Farm, and the cheerful bunting seemed to mock the grim tableau below. Someone among them was a murderer, and the Apple Harvest Festival had become a trap from which none could escape until justice was served. Inspector Craddock moved through the crowd with methodical precision, his experienced eye cataloguing details while maintaining the delicate balance between authority and village sensibilities. The festive atmosphere had completely evaporated, replaced by the peculiar mixture of horror and fascination that violent death inevitably brought to quiet communities. Miss Marple observed how naturally the villagers segregated themselves along familiar social lines, seeking comfort in established hierarchies, even as those very relationships now carried the weight of suspicion. Dr. Fleming, Can you provide more details about what you observed? Inspector Craddock's notebook was already filling with preliminary observations, his pen poised for the medical assessment that would guide the investigation. Dr. Fleming consulted her hastily scribbled notes with professional detachment. The symptoms were entirely consistent with cyanide, poisoning the rapid onset, flushed skin, and the distinctive bitter almond scent I detected during my examination. Death would have occurred within minutes of ingestion. Fatal dessert. The poison was almost certainly contained within that particular tart. The lattice pattern would have provided excellent concealment for any foreign substance mixed into the filling. Constable Hemlock returned from his preliminary search of the area, holding up a small card with obvious excitement. "Inspector, we've found something peculiar. This entry card was pinned beneath the judging table. It's marked number 4. But there's no name on it." He gestured toward the lattice tart. "That corresponds to the poisoned dessert, sir." Mrs. Pembroke's clipboard trembled in her hands as she consulted her official list. "That's impossible. I personally numbered every entry and recorded each baker's name. The lattice tart wasn't on my list when I completed the arrangements at 3:30. Her voice carried a note of defensive authority, though Miss Marple noticed how her knuckles had gone white around the clipboard's edges. This revelation sent a fresh wave of unease through the gathered villagers. Owen Pritchard shifted uncomfortably near the cider barrels, his weathered hands working nervously at his cap. "Begging your pardon, but Mr. Grayling weren't exactly beloved by everyone. Just last week he foreclosed on the Henderson farm, and there's been considerable talk about his plans for the common land." Margaret Grayling, supported by her son Peter, looked up sharply at this frank assessment. "You have no right to speak ill of Thomas when he can no longer defend himself," she protested, though her voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple noted how Peter's arm tightened protectively around his mother, yet his expression held something that might have been relief rather than grief. Mrs. Pembroke drew herself to her full height, her clipboard now serving as both shield and weapon. "Owen Pritchard, everyone knows you've harbored resentment against Thomas for 30 years. Perhaps you finally decided to act on those old grievances." The accusation hung in the air like smoke, and Miss Marple saw how quickly alliances formed and reformed among the villagers. She had been quietly observing Mrs. Pembroke throughout the exchange, noting the faint orange smear near the bottom edge of her clipboard and what appeared to be a translucent grain sugar, or perhaps apricot gel, catching the slanting sunlight. "Apricot glaze is quite useful for achieving that particular shine," Miss Marple murmured to herself, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, though warm glaze can make papers stick rather stubbornly to one's hands. Reverend Ashworth cleared his throat nervously, his usual serenity notably absent. "Inspector, I feel I should mention that I observed someone near the judging table earlier, though I'm afraid I didn't pay close attention at the time. A figure in dark clothing, arranging something among the entries. I assumed it was one of the volunteers making final preparations." Inspector Craddock made careful notes of this vague but potentially significant testimony. "Can you be more specific about the timing, Reverend?" "Shortly after the blessing, I believe. The light was beginning to fade, and there were so many people moving about." The Reverend's gaze drifted once again toward the hollow oak, as it had repeatedly throughout the afternoon. The inspector followed his glance with interest. "Constable Hemlock, I want you to search that tree thoroughly. If someone needed to dispose of evidence quickly, an old hollow would serve admirably." As the young constable approached the ancient oak, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught a brief glint from within its dark recesses. As if the tree itself harbored secrets, it was reluctant to surrender. The investigation was only beginning, but already the peaceful facade of Little Wickham was cracking, revealing the complex web of resentments, secrets, and hidden motives that lay beneath the surface of village life. Constable Hemlock approached the hollow oak with visible reluctance, his flashlight beam probing the dark interior that had sheltered secrets for centuries. The gathered villagers watched in tense silence as he reached carefully into the shadowy depths, his young face contorting with concentration and growing excitement. "Inspector, there's definitely something here," he called, his voice tight with discovery. After several moments of careful exploration, he withdrew his hand holding a small glass vial, its cork still intact and traces of white crystalline residue clinging to its sides. A crumpled paper doily followed, along with a bent safety pin that glinted in the fading afternoon light. Inspector Craddock accepted the evidence with professional satisfaction, though his expression remained carefully neutral. "Dr. Fleming, would you examine this vial?" He held it toward her, and she leaned forward cautiously, her medical training evident in her careful assessment. "The residue appears consistent with a cyanide compound," she confirmed after a brief examination. "The bitter almond scent is quite distinctive, and there would have been enough here to kill several people." Her clinical detachment couldn't quite mask the gravity of her assessment. The discovery sent a visible shiver through the assembled crowd. Owen Pritchard stepped back involuntarily, his weathered face pale beneath his cap. "I never went near that tree today," he declared with unnecessary vehemence. "Been working the cider press since morning, and plenty can vouch for that." Mrs. Pembroke's authoritative facade wavered slightly as she consulted her clipboard with renewed intensity. "The paper doily suggests someone removed evidence from beneath one of the tarts," she announced, though her voice carried a defensive edge. "And that safety pin would have been used to attach the number card when paste proved inconvenient." Inspector Craddock's methodical mind was already forming conclusions. Owen Pritchard, with his long-standing grudge against Thomas Grayling and his obvious agitation, presented the clearest motive. The inspector saw efficiency in focusing on the most obvious suspect, particularly when village sentiment seemed to support this direction. "Always knew that Owen would come to trouble eventually," Mrs. Gibbs muttered from the crowd, her pronouncement carrying the weight of village consensus. The whispers that followed seemed to settle on Owen as the most likely culprit, their collective judgment reinforcing Craddock's initial assessment. Miss Marple continued her quiet observation, noting how each revelation shifted the dynamics among the villagers. Margaret Grayling had grown increasingly agitated, her earlier grief now mixed with something that might have been fear. Peter remained protectively close to his mother, yet his eyes kept darting toward Dr. Fleming with an expression Miss Marple found particularly interesting. Reverend Ashworth cleared his throat nervously, his usual serenity notably absent. "Inspector, I feel compelled to mention that Thomas had been receiving threatening letters recently. He confided in me during our last pastoral visit, though he insisted they were merely the work of a disgruntled tenant." This revelation added another layer to the case, though Inspector Craddock seemed more interested in pursuing his obvious suspect than exploring complex possibilities. "Mr. Pritchard, I'll need you to accompany Constable Hemlock for formal questioning. The rest of you will remain here until we've completed our preliminary investigation." As Owen was led away, his protests of innocence echoing across the farmyard, Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their rhythmic clicking. While the police saw a straightforward case of revenge, she observed a pattern that felt too convenient, too neatly packaged. Owen Pritchard, for all his bluster and grievances, was a man of predictable passions. His resentment burned slowly, not with the calculated precision this murder required. The faint apricot stain on Mrs. Pembroke's clipboard continued to intrigue her, along with the woman's almost eager finger-pointing. Miss Marple had learned that the most dangerous criminals often appeared the most helpful, deflecting suspicion through zealous cooperation. The truth, she suspected, lay deeper than simple revenge, hidden beneath the complex web of village relationships that were only beginning to unravel under the pressure of murder. With Owen Pritchard's protestations fading into the evening air, Inspector Craddock directed the remaining villagers toward the farmhouse kitchen, where the warm glow of oil lamps provided refuge from the gathering dusk. The massive oak table that had witnessed countless family meals now served as an impromptu interrogation center, its scrubbed surface reflecting the serious faces gathered around it. Miss Marple accepted a chair near the dresser, positioning herself where she could observe without seeming intrusive. Her knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as Inspector Craddock established order with practiced efficiency, though her sharp eyes missed nothing of the human drama unfolding before her. "Mrs. Pembroke," the inspector began, consulting his notebook, "you mentioned the lattice tart wasn't on your official list. Can you elaborate on your numbering system?" Dorothy Pembroke straightened her shoulders, her clipboard clutched defensively. "I numbered every entry by 3:30, Inspector. Each baker received a card when they registered their tart. The lattice entry simply wasn't there when I completed my final inspection." Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to having her organizational skills respected, yet Miss Marple noticed the faint tremor in her hands. Dr. Fleming, seated across from Margaret Grayling, maintained her professional composure as she provided her medical assessment. The symptoms were unmistakable rapid onset. The distinctive bitter almond scent. Whoever prepared the tart possessed considerable knowledge of both baking techniques and poison application. She paused, her clinical gaze fixed on some middle distance. The lattice work was extraordinarily precise, not something an amateur would attempt. Young Peter Grayling shifted uncomfortably when questioned about his movements. "I checked the wasp traps near the orchard, then helped arrange the cider barrels. Father preferred I keep my distance during judging, said I made him nervous." His explanation seemed rehearsed, and Miss Marple observed the curious absence of orchard mud on his boots despite his claimed activities. Margaret Grayling's testimony revealed an intriguing detail that sent ripples of speculation through the gathered villagers. "Thomas had been unusually secretive lately," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "He locked his bureau for the first time in 30 years and mentioned making an important announcement today. He refused to tell me the nature of it." Reverend Ashworth cleared his throat nervously. "I should mention that someone approached me earlier asking about the judging procedure, specifically whether Thomas would taste every entry or make selections. At the time, I assumed it was merely curiosity about the competition format." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of young Tom Henderson, the farm boy who helped with odd jobs around the property. His face was flushed with excitement and anxiety as he addressed Inspector Craddock. "Begging your pardon, sir, but I found something peculiar in the scullery ash bucket. Mrs. Grayling asked me to empty it earlier, but with all the commotion, I forgot until now." Constable Hemlock retrieved the evidence under Craddock's supervision, a shallow tart tin bearing traces of what appeared to be apricot glaze, along with a folded square of parchment paper. The discovery sent a visible shock through the assembled group, particularly Mrs. Pembroke, whose clipboard shifted protectively against her chest. Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully as she observed the reactions around the table. "Apricot glaze is quite particular," she murmured to no one in particular. "It must be applied at precisely the right temperature to achieve that glossy finish without melting the pastry beneath. Too hot, and it creates quite a mess on one's hands and implements." Dr. Fleming's sharp intake of breath didn't go unnoticed, nor did the way Mrs. Pembroke's knuckles whitened around her clipboard. The tart tin represented concrete evidence that the murder had been carefully planned and executed, requiring intimate knowledge of both the farmhouse layout and baking techniques. Inspector Craddock studied the assembled faces with renewed interest. The case against Owen Pritchard, while convenient, was beginning to feel insufficient. Someone among them possessed the skills, knowledge, and opportunity to commit this calculated crime, and the evening's revelations suggested the truth lay deeper than simple revenge. The discovery of the tart, tin, and parchment paper transformed the kitchen atmosphere from tense inquiry to focused investigation. Inspector Craddock examined the evidence with methodical precision, noting the professional quality of the baking implement and the distinctive residue patterns that spoke of careful preparation rather than desperate improvisation. "This parchment shows considerable planning," he observed, holding the crumpled paper toward the lamplight. Heat had puckered its surface, but faint pencil marks remained a measured grid, with small arrows suggesting precise alignment rather than casual notes. Orange residue clung to one corner, and several translucent grains flaked away onto the scrubbed table like crystallized amber. Someone used this as a positioning guide for the lattice work. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused thoughtfully. How interesting that someone would require such careful preparation, she mused quietly. A lattice is quite delicate work, requiring steady hands and considerable confidence. One would need to be certain of both technique and timing. Mrs. Pembroke's defensive posture became increasingly pronounced as attention focused on the technical aspects of the crime. Any competent baker could manage such work, she declared, though her voice carried less conviction than usual. Her clipboard shifted protectively against her chest, and Miss Marple noticed how her thumb left a faint, tacky impression on its surface before she quickly adjusted her grip. Fleming leaned forward to study the evidence with clinical interest. The glaze application is remarkably even, and the parchment suggests someone familiar with professional techniques. Apricot glaze must be applied at precisely the right temperature, too hot, and it creates quite a mess on one's hands and implements. Her own hands, Miss Marple observed, showed the faint redness that hot water gives, and her gaze kept returning to the tart tin with something that might have been recognition. The conversation took a darker turn when Constable Hemlock returned from his expanded search of the property, carrying a leather portfolio that had been concealed in the stable loft. "Inspector, I've discovered correspondence that sheds new light on Mr. Grayling's recent activities," he announced, his young face grave with the weight of his findings. The letters, when examined, revealed a complex web of financial pressures that cast Thomas Grayling's secretive behavior in an entirely new light. Several creditors were demanding immediate payment, and there were ominous references to foreclosure proceedings that would affect not only Hollow Tree Farm but multiple properties throughout Little Wickham. More disturbing still was a series of threatening messages, crudely assembled from newspaper clippings. "Your grasping ends now. Leave the common, or we will stop you." Margaret Grayling's composure finally cracked, as she absorbed the implications of her husband's hidden correspondence. "He'd been having private meetings with a London solicitor," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I overheard him mention a new will and something about disinheritance. He was planning to make significant changes that would affect us all." Peter Grayling's reaction to his mother's revelation was telling, his face flushed with what appeared to be a mixture of fear and barely suppressed anger. "Father was always threatening to cut me out," he said with bitter resignation. "Said I wasn't man enough to run Hollow Tree Farm, but surely he wouldn't have gone through with it." His words, meant to deflect suspicion, instead painted a picture of deep familial resentment and desperate financial dependence. Dr. Fleming's professional composure faltered as her own name appeared among the correspondence. "Thomas was my landlord," she admitted reluctantly, her clinical detachment finally cracking. "He'd been pressuring me to vacate my cottage, claiming he needed the property for other purposes. The rent increases had become quite unreasonable, and he'd threatened eviction if I couldn't meet his demands." Reverend Ashworth produced another envelope with visible reluctance. "Thomas asked me to keep these in confidence until he decided what to do," he explained, revealing additional threatening letters that spoke of retribution for perceived injustices. "He mentioned making an important announcement today, something about setting things right and protecting the family legacy." Miss Marple's sharp eyes catalogued every reaction, every telling gesture as the web of motives expanded. Peter's polished boots showed no trace of orchard mud, despite his claimed activities there. Mrs. Pembroke's clipboard bore that suspicious apricot stain, and her eager finger-pointing seemed designed to deflect attention from her own intimate knowledge of the farmhouse routines. Dr. Fleming's hands remained very still, and her medical expertise would certainly encompass knowledge of poisons and their effects. "A thought occurs about timing," Miss Marple said gently, her needles resuming their rhythmic clicking. "A lattice is best attached, while the filling retains warmth too cold, and the strips refuse to adhere properly. Someone would need access to a heated kitchen and considerable confidence in their welcome. Inspector Craddock studied the assembled faces with growing awareness that the case was far more complex than simple revenge. Thomas Grayling's planned announcement about disinheritance provided multiple suspects with desperate motives, while the carefully planned nature of the crime suggested a mind capable of both patience and ruthless calculation. Someone among them had killed to protect themselves from financial or personal ruin, and the evening's revelations suggested the truth lay deeper than anyone had yet imagined. The golden afternoon had long since faded to evening shadows, and the cheerful festival bunting outside now seemed to mock the grim reality within. The investigation was entering a new phase, where hidden secrets and desperate motives would soon force the killer to reveal themselves through their own actions. As the evening shadows deepened around Hollow Tree Farm, Inspector Craddock suggested they move their inquiry to Thomas Grayling's private study. The assembled group filed through the narrow corridor, their footsteps muffled by well-worn carpeting, while Margaret led the way with a heavy brass lamp that cast dancing shadows across paneled walls, lined with agricultural journals and account ledgers. The study itself bore the unmistakable stamp of Thomas's methodical personality, everything precisely arranged, from the leather-bound books to the collection of farming implements displayed as decorative pieces. Yet Miss Marple's sharp eyes immediately noted subtle signs of recent disturbance. A faint line of dust along the mantelpiece where something had been moved, and the lingering scent of pipe tobacco mixed with something sweeter that might have been apricot preserves. Margaret said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper as she approached the massive oak piece that dominated one wall. Thomas began locking it just last week. He said it contained important family matters that required privacy. Her trembling hand indicated the heavy brass lock that secured the writing surface, its keyhole dark and forbidding in the lamplight. Peter shifted uncomfortably beside his mother, his earlier composure finally beginning to crack under the sustained pressure of investigation. Father mentioned the keychain had broken this morning, he offered, though his voice lacked conviction. He said he'd repair it after the judging was complete. Inspector Craddock examined the lock mechanism with professional interest, noting the absence of scratches or forced entry marks that would suggest tampering. Mrs. Grayling. Would there be a spare key available? His methodical approach left no detail unexplored, and Margaret's hesitant nod directed Constable Hemlock to search the kitchen dresser. The discovery of a second key in an old tea caddy seemed almost providential, though Miss Marple observed with interest how readily it came to hand, as if someone had known exactly where to look. The lock turned with surprising ease, revealing the bureau's organized interior neat pigeonholes filled with correspondence, a central compartment containing legal documents, and tellingly, one empty slot where something significant had clearly been removed. Inspector Craddock sorted through the papers with methodical precision, his expression growing increasingly grave as the contents revealed themselves. Letters from London solicitors spoke of urgent financial restructuring, while threatening messages demanded Thomas cease his aggressive land acquisitions. Most significantly, a sealed envelope, marked "To be read at the harvest supper," contained Thomas's intended announcement, a complete reorganization of his estate that would place Hollow Tree Farm in charitable trust for the village commons. "There's more," Craddock continued, his voice carrying the weight of significant revelation. Mr. Grayling had executed a new will, depositing it in this very bureau. According to his correspondence, it completely disinherited Peter based on evidence of illegitimacy and left only a modest annuity to Margaret. The bulk of the estate, including the disputed common land, was to benefit the village through an agricultural trust. The silence that followed this announcement was profound and telling. Peter's face drained of all color, his hands clenching involuntarily as the full implications struck him. Margaret swayed slightly, requiring Dr. Fleming's steadying hand as she absorbed the devastating news of her husband's secret plans. "The will itself, however, is missing," Inspector Craddock observed, indicating the empty document slot. "Someone removed it from this bureau, and recently, judging by the disturbance patterns in the dust. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she observed the reactions around her. Peter's polished boots, she noted with interest, showed no trace of orchard mud despite his claimed afternoon activities there. More intriguingly, a faint, tacky residue marked the bureau's writing surface, the unmistakable signature of apricot glaze that had been touched before fully setting. Dr. Fleming maintained her professional composure, though her hands remained unusually still, and her medical expertise would certainly encompass knowledge of both poisons and their applications. Mrs. Pembroke's clipboard, Miss Marple observed, bore a suspicious orange stain near its lower edge, while her defensive protestations about the lattice tart seemed increasingly forced. How curious, Miss Marple murmured thoughtfully, that someone would require such careful timing. Apricot glaze must be applied while still warm to achieve proper adhesion, yet it becomes quite sticky if handled before cooling completely. One would need intimate knowledge of both baking techniques and household routines to manage such delicate work. Constable Hemlock's examination of the fireplace grate revealed additional evidence, charred fragments of legal ribbon, and what appeared to be portions of an official seal bearing the Grayling family crest. Someone had attempted to destroy the missing will, though their hasty work had left incriminating traces. The investigation was reaching its critical phase, and Miss Marple could sense the killer's growing desperation as their carefully constructed plan began to unravel. The revelation of Thomas's intended disinheritance provided powerful motives for multiple suspects, while the physical evidence pointed toward someone with both intimate household knowledge and considerable baking expertise. Soon, very soon, the truth would emerge through the killer's own desperate actions. The discovery of the charred will fragments cast a pall of desperate calculation over the investigation, transforming what had appeared to be impulsive revenge into something far more sinister. Inspector Craddock knelt beside the cold fireplace, his experienced fingers sorting through the methodically destroyed evidence with growing understanding of the killer's ruthless precision. This destruction was carefully planned, he observed, rising with several fragments preserved in his handkerchief. The legal ribbon was burned in precise sections, the wax seal deliberately scattered. Someone understood exactly what they were destroying and took considerable care to ensure it could never be reconstructed. Peter Grayling stood frozen beside the mantelpiece, his face bearing the pallor of someone who had narrowly escaped financial ruin through another's death. The revelation of his planned disinheritance hung in the air like smoke, while Margaret clutched her shawl with trembling fingers, her earlier grief now mixed with unmistakable relief at avoiding reduced circumstances. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she observed the subtle shifts in behavior around the study. Dr. Fleming maintained her professional composure while examining the ash fragments, though her hands remained unusually still. Mrs. Pembroke's defensive posture had become increasingly pronounced, her clipboard shifting protectively against her chest as attention focused on the technical aspects of the crime. "The timing troubles me," Inspector Craddock continued, his methodical mind working through the logistics. "The will was removed and destroyed after the murder, but before we secured the premises. Someone with immediate access and intimate knowledge of household routines." Constable Hemlock's thorough search behind the leather-bound volumes yielded another crucial discovery: a small cloth bundle containing a spare bureau key, folded parchment bearing careful measurements in feminine handwriting, and most damning of all, a second vial identical to the one found in the hollow oak. "Anyone could have hidden those items," Mrs. Pembroke declared, though her voice carried less authority than usual. Miss Marple noted with interest how her thumb continued leaving tacky impressions on the clipboard surface, and how sugar crystals glittered along her cuff when she adjusted her sleeve. "How fascinating," Miss Marple murmured, her sharp eyes fixed on the bureau's sticky writing surface. "Apricot glaze is such particular work, requiring precise timing and steady hands. One must apply it while still warm for proper adhesion, yet it becomes dreadfully sticky if handled before cooling completely." Dr. Fleming's slight intake of breath didn't escape notice, nor did the way Mrs. Pembroke's knuckles whitened around her clipboard. The elderly detective's seemingly innocent observations carried weight that made several suspects shift uncomfortably. Young Tom Henderson's arrival provided another significant development. "Begging your pardon, Inspector, but I've found something peculiar in the scullery pantry," he announced breathlessly. Hidden behind the flour sacks, a professional tart tin with fresh apricot residue and measuring spoons that smell strongly of bitter almonds. This discovery sent visible tremors through the assembled group. Mrs. Pembroke's organizational skills would certainly encompass knowledge of the farmhouse storage areas, while Dr. Fleming's medical expertise included detailed understanding of poison preparation and application. Inspector Craddock studied the evidence with growing clarity about the crime's sophisticated planning. Someone with access to both professional baking equipment and intimate knowledge of Mr. Grayling's routines, he concluded. The lattice technique, the precise timing, the careful disposal of evidence, this required considerable skill and preparation. Miss Marple rose quietly from her chair, moving toward the window overlooking the darkened farmyard, where festival bunting still fluttered mockingly in the evening breeze. The investigation was approaching its climax, and she could sense the killer's growing desperation as their carefully constructed plan began unraveling through accumulated evidence and behavioral observations. Truth has a way of revealing itself through the smallest details, she observed gently. A sticky fingerprint here, a grain of sugar there, the particular way someone holds their hands when nervous. Human nature, Inspector, remains remarkably consistent, even under the most extraordinary circumstances. The lamp flames flickered in their glass chimneys, casting dancing shadows across the study walls as the evening's revelations pointed inexorably toward a conclusion that would shock the peaceful village of Little Wickham to its very foundations. The evening air in the study grew thick with unspoken accusations as Inspector Craddock's methodical examination of the evidence began pointing toward an inescapable conclusion. The charred will fragments, the professional baking implements, and the careful timing all suggested a killer with both intimate household knowledge and desperate motivation to prevent Thomas Grayling's planned announcement. A commotion from the scullery interrupted the tense atmosphere as Constable Hemlock called urgently from the corridor. "Inspector, there's been another attempt to destroy evidence." The assembled group followed him toward the back of the house, where a thin curl of smoke rose from the ash bucket beside the pantry door. Within lay a smoldering cloth rag, hastily extinguished but still bearing the acrid scent of burned fabric, and something sweeter, the unmistakable aroma of apricot preserves. Inspector Craddock examined the scene with professional interest, noting the unlatched scullery window that provided access to the night air. Someone attempted to dispose of additional evidence, he observed, though their hasty method proved inadequate. His gaze moved to the pantry shelves, where the measuring spoons discovered earlier had mysteriously vanished, leaving only a faint ring of moisture to mark their previous location. Behind a stack of plates, Constable Hemlock discovered a pastry brush that had been hastily concealed, its bristles still beaded with glossy residue that caught the lamplight. The implement bore the telltale signs of recent use, and Dr. Fleming's examination confirmed the presence of apricot glaze that remained tacky to the touch. Still warm when it was hidden, she observed with clinical detachment, though Miss Marple noted how the doctor's hands remained carefully folded after her brief examination. The medical knowledge required for poison preparation, combined with her frequent visits to Hollow Tree Farm, kept Dr. Fleming among the suspects, despite her professional demeanor. Mrs. Pembroke was first to recover her voice, her organizational instincts asserting themselves even under pressure. "This is quite intolerable," she declared, moving toward the unlatched window with efficient movements. "Anyone might wander through when the place is in such disarray." Miss Marple observed with interest how her hand hesitated fractionally before touching the latch, as if recalling a previous encounter with something warm and sticky. "Leave that window as it is," Inspector Craddock instructed firmly. Who had access to this scullery after we secured the main crime scene? The question hung in the air as each suspect considered their movements and alibis, while the evidence continued to point towards someone with intimate knowledge of the farmhouse layout and routines. Miss Marple resumed her seat near the dresser, her knitting needles clicking thoughtfully as she observed the subtle behavioral tells that revealed more than words ever could. How fascinating that apricot glaze should prove so persistent, she murmured gently. Even after careful washing, it tends to cling to one's implements and papers. Sugar crystals, too, have a way of adhering to fabric cuffs when one works with warm preserves. Her seemingly innocent observation sent a visible tremor through Mrs. Pembroke's carefully maintained composure. The clipboard, pressed against her chest, bore that telltale orange stain along its lower edge, while her thumb continued leaving tacky impressions despite obvious attempts at control. The accumulated evidence was becoming impossible to ignore: the professional baking expertise, the intimate household knowledge, the desperate motivation to prevent Thomas's charitable trust announcement. The timing required for this crime was quite extraordinary. Miss Marple continued, her blue eyes fixed on Mrs. Pembroke with gentle but penetrating assessment. Apricot glaze must be applied while still warm for proper adhesion, yet becomes dreadfully sticky if handled before cooling completely. Someone needed access to a heated kitchen and considerable confidence in their welcome at Hollow Tree Farm. Peter Grayling shifted uncomfortably beside his mother, his earlier relief at avoiding disinheritance now overshadowed by the mounting evidence against their trusted household manager. Margaret clutched her shawl with trembling fingers, unable to reconcile the woman she had relied upon for 30 years with the calculating killer the evidence suggested. Inspector Craddock's experienced eye catalogued every reaction, every telling gesture as the psychological pressure intensified. Mrs. Pembroke's authoritative facade was beginning to crack under the accumulated weight of physical evidence and behavioral observation, though she maintained her defensive posture with characteristic determination. The professional tart tin, the precise measurements, the careful destruction of evidence, the inspector summarized methodically. This wasn't impulsive revenge but calculated murder, requiring someone with both specialized knowledge and intimate access to household routines. Miss Marple's needles paused as she prepared to apply the final, gentle pressure that would force the truth into the open. The investigation was approaching its climax, and she could sense the killer's growing desperation as their carefully constructed plan unraveled through the inexorable accumulation of evidence and the relentless logic of human behavior. The lamplight flickered across the scullery walls as the evening's revelations pointed inexorably toward a conclusion that would expose the calculated nature of Thomas Grayling's murder and the desperate measures taken to conceal it. Soon, very soon, the truth would emerge through the killer's own actions, revealing how greed and wounded pride had transformed a trusted household manager into a ruthless murderer. The scullery fell into a charged silence as Miss Marple's gentle observations settled over the assembled group like gathering storm clouds. Mrs. Pembroke stood rigidly beside the unlatched window, her clipboard pressed against her chest, while Inspector Craddock studied the hastily concealed evidence with growing understanding of the crime's calculated nature. Perhaps, Miss Marple suggested with deceptive mildness, we might return to the study for a moment. I believe there are still matters requiring attention. Her blue eyes fixed on Mrs. Pembroke with gentle but penetrating assessment, noting how the woman's knuckles had gone white around her clipboard's edges. Inspector Craddock understood immediately, leading the group back through the narrow corridor while maintaining careful observation of each suspect's behavior. In the study, he made a deliberate show of examining the bureau's contents, leaving the writing surface partially exposed while commenting loudly about reconstructing the destroyed will from remaining fragments. "We'll need to preserve everything exactly as we found it," he announced, positioning himself where he could observe the assembled group. "The evidence here will be crucial for the morning's formal proceedings." Mrs. Pembroke's authoritative facade began showing hairline cracks as the psychological pressure intensified. Her thumb continued leaving those telltale tacky impressions on the clipboard's surface, while sugar crystals glittered along her cuff in the lamplight. The accumulated evidence was becoming impossible to ignore, yet she maintained her defensive posture with characteristic stubbornness. Miss Marple resumed her knitting with deliberate calm, her needles clicking rhythmically as she observed the subtle tells that revealed more than words ever could. "It's remarkable how apricot glaze betrays even the most careful hands," she murmured thoughtfully. Such particular timing required warm enough for proper adhesion, yet cool enough to handle without leaving sticky traces on everything one touches. The gentle words struck with surgical precision, and Mrs. Pembroke's composure finally began cracking under the accumulated weight of evidence and observation. Inspector Craddock stepped forward with methodical authority, his notebook filled with damning details. "Mrs. Pembroke, we found your fingerprints on the spare bureau key hidden behind those books. The measurements on that parchment match your handwriting from the festival registration forms. Most significantly, the apricot glaze residue on your clipboard and clothing places you at the crime scene during the critical preparation period." Her carefully constructed defense crumbled as the forensic reality became undeniable. 30 years, she whispered, her voice breaking with accumulated resentment. 30 years of managing this household, organizing Thomas's obligations, maintaining his reputation in the community, and he planned to cast me aside like worn furniture for some ridiculous charitable gesture. The confession poured forth with bitter force as her organizational facade finally shattered completely. The discovery of Thomas's trust plans while managing his correspondence had triggered desperate calculation rather than acceptance. Her intimate knowledge of household routines provided opportunity, while her professional baking skills, honed through decades of managing harvest festivals, supplied the lethal means. "You prepared the poisoned tart in the scullery during the early afternoon," Miss Marple observed with professional appreciation. "Your authority as festival organizer provided perfect cover for accessing the kitchen without suspicion. The lattice technique was quite clever. The professional glaze work disguised any telltale bitterness, while the careful measurements ensured precise poison distribution." Mrs. Pembroke sagged against the bureau, her clipboard finally falling to the carpet with a clatter that seemed to echo through the farmhouse. "He never valued my contributions," she said with bitter resignation. "Never understood that his precious family reputation depended entirely on my efforts. The charitable trust would have destroyed everything I'd worked to build and maintain." The revelation sent visible shudders through the assembled villagers. Margaret Grayling wept quietly into her handkerchief, while Peter stood frozen beside his mother, unable to reconcile their trusted household manager with the ruthless killer the evidence revealed. Dr. Fleming maintained her professional composure, though her hands trembled slightly as she absorbed the implications. Constable Hemlock moved forward with reluctant efficiency, his young face showing the strain of arresting someone he had known since childhood. The peaceful village of Little Wickham would never quite recover from learning that murder could emerge from such ordinary circumstances. Wounded pride, financial insecurity, and the desperate measures people take when their carefully constructed lives face destruction. Miss Marple retrieved her knitting with quiet satisfaction, her needles resuming their gentle rhythm as another human tragedy reached its inevitable conclusion through the inexorable logic of evidence and the revealing nature of human behavior under pressure. The arrest of Mrs. Pembroke broke the brittle tension that had held the farmhouse in its grip throughout the evening's revelations. Constable Hemlock approached with visible reluctance, his young face bearing the strain of arresting someone he had known since childhood. Mrs. Pembroke offered no resistance, her authoritative facade finally crumbling to reveal the desperate woman beneath as the handcuffs clicked into place with metallic finality. Inspector Craddock closed his notebook with professional satisfaction, though his expression remained grave as he turned to Miss Marple. "If you would, ma'am, I should like the complete picture set down clearly, how you knew from the beginning." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused thoughtfully before she set her work in her lap. "It was never so much knowledge, Inspector, as recognition of patterns in human behavior." Mrs. Pembroke presented herself as the helpful organizer, but her eagerness to direct suspicion toward others troubled me greatly. The apricot glaze residue on her clipboard, the sugar crystals clinging to her cuff, the tacky impressions her thumb left. Despite obvious attempts at control, apricot glaze is such a persistent tattletale. She gestured delicately toward the bureau, where the evidence had accumulated. The numbered entry without a name suggested someone familiar with festival procedures but anxious to escape attribution. The professional lattice technique, the precise measurements on that parchment guide, the intimate knowledge required for kitchen access during the blessing ceremony all pointed toward someone with both household authority and desperate motivation. Mrs. Pembroke's voice carried bitter resignation as she provided the final technical details. The cyanide came from old photography chemicals in the stable loft. Thomas had forgotten them entirely, but I remembered helping clear his father's darkroom equipment years ago. The lattice tart was prepared in the scullery, while everyone's attention focused on Reverend Ashworth's ceremony. My festival authority provided perfect cover for accessing the kitchen without suspicion. Margaret Grayling looked up from her handkerchief with dawning understanding of the complete betrayal. You suggested Thomas had mentioned losing his keychain this morning. You knew exactly where the spare bureau key was hidden because you had placed it there yourself for convenient access to his correspondence. Her voice carried the wounded tone of someone who had trusted completely and been deceived utterly. Peter remained frozen beside his mother, his earlier relief at avoiding disinheritance now overshadowed by the horrifying realization that Mrs. Pembroke had committed murder partly to protect what she saw as his rightful inheritance. The weight of unintended complicity would haunt him far longer than any financial difficulties. Dr. Fleming maintained her professional composure while examining the psychological aspects revealed. The planning required remarkable nerve and precision, preparing poison, timing, kitchen access, managing evidence disposal. This wasn't impulsive revenge but calculated murder executed with methodical efficiency. Miss Marple's blue eyes held gentle sadness as she observed the human wreckage around her. Mrs. Pembroke saw herself as the true guardian of Hollow Tree Farm's legacy, the one who understood its value and protected its interests. Thomas's charitable trust wasn't merely a financial restructuring in her mind. It was personal repudiation of 30 years' faithful service, an insult to her very existence within this household. Inspector Craddock made careful notes about practical next steps. We'll contact the London solicitors immediately. There's every likelihood they maintained copies or drafts of the will. Intent in such cases is often preserved through duplicate documentation. As the evening wound toward its conclusion, the assembled villagers began absorbing the full implications of their trusted festival organizers' calculated crime. The cheerful bunting still fluttered outside in the cooling air, though it now seemed to mock the grim reality within. Little Wickham would return to its peaceful rhythms eventually. But the echo of Thomas Grayling's collapse and the chilling revelation of his killer would linger for generations. Miss Marple gathered her knitting with quiet satisfaction, her needles resuming their gentle rhythm as another human tragedy reached its inevitable conclusion through the inexorable logic of evidence and the revealing nature of behavior under pressure. Murder, she reflected, so seldom arrived as rage, more often emerged from wounded pride, perceived injustice, and the desperate measures people take when their carefully constructed lives face destruction. The police vehicle's departure left Hollow Tree Farm shrouded in an uneasy silence, its headlights sweeping across the cobbled yard one final time before carrying Mrs. Pembroke into the darkness. The remaining villagers stood in awkward clusters, their festive afternoon transformed into something they would struggle to comprehend, much less forget. The cheerful bunting still fluttered overhead, now seeming to mock the grim reality that had unfolded beneath its colorful presence. Margaret Grayling emerged from the farmhouse supported by Peter, her face bearing the pallor of profound betrayal. 30 years, she whispered, her voice carrying the bewildered tone of someone whose fundamental understanding of the world had been shattered. She organized our Christmas dinners, managed our accounts, taught me her apple tart recipe. How does someone harbor such resentment while maintaining such perfect pretense? Dr. Fleming approached with professional concern, her medical training asserting itself despite her own unsettled state. Shock manifests differently in everyone, she observed gently. The mind struggles to reconcile familiar faces with unthinkable actions. Her own position as Thomas's threatened tenant had been revealed, yet she remained to offer what comfort she could. In the days that followed, little Wickham grappled with the shocking truth. News of Mrs. Pembroke's arrest spread like wildfire, igniting gossip that quickly replaced initial fear. Everyone suddenly had a story, a subtle sign they claimed to have noticed all along, conveniently forgetting their earlier certainty about Owen Pritchard's guilt. The image of the meticulous, indispensable Mrs. Pembroke as a calculating murderess shattered comfortable illusions about their peaceful community. Inspector Craddock's investigation concluded with confirmation from the London solicitors Thomas's charitable trust documents existed in duplicate, ensuring his intentions would be honoured despite the destroyed will. Peter, confronted with legal reality rather than paternal threats, managed a quiet acceptance that sounded less like defeat than the first tentative notes of maturity. He surprised both his mother and himself by suggesting they retain Owen at fair wages, saying simply, "It must be a trust that truly serves." The inquest, held in the schoolroom with its familiar scent of chalk and varnish, proved mercifully brief. Dr. Fleming's testimony was crisp and clinical, while Mrs. Pembroke's signed confession removed most doubt. The verdict of willful murder was returned without dramatic outbursts. Only a communal shrinking from the precise moment when neighbourly knowledge had transformed into lethal calculation. Miss Marple remained for several more days, observing the village's slow, uncertain return to normalcy. The festival decorations came down, the cider press was dismantled, but the memory of Thomas Grayling's collapse lingered in every corner. Children were hushed when they mentioned the poisoned tart, while adults eyed each other with subtle new suspicion. On her final morning, Inspector Craddock called to bid farewell. "Remarkable work, Miss Marple," he said with genuine admiration. "You saw truth where we saw only the obvious." Miss Marple smiled gently, her knitting bag prepared for departure. "Not so remarkable, Inspector. Human nature remains constant whether in Street, Mary Mead or Little Wickham. Pride, resentment, perceived injustice, these are powerful forces, capable of driving even the most respectable individuals to desperate acts. Mrs. Pembroke felt her life's work dismissed, her value denied. For some, such wounds prove harder to bear than financial ruin. She gathered her shawl, gazing toward the ancient hollow oak that had harbored such dark secrets. The peace of a village is fragile, built on trust and unspoken understanding. When that trust breaks, it leaves lasting scars. People will remember that evil can wear the most familiar face. As Miss Marple departed through the farm gate, the morning wind rustled through the oak's hollow trunk, carrying away the last whispers of murder, while the peaceful English countryside settled into a silence that would never again seem quite so innocent to those who had witnessed the calculated death at Hollow Tree Farm. Autumn deepened gently over Little Wickham, and with it the village's pulse steadied into something approaching normal rhythm. The London solicitors had dispatched neat envelopes stamped with legal certainty. Thomas Grayling's charitable trust would stand as intended. Margaret's modest annuity secured her future, while Peter, pale, chastened, but oddly steadier, signed the necessary documents without protest. His father's domineering shadow had lifted, revealing a young man capable of genuine responsibility when freed from constant criticism. Owen Pritchard retained his position at fair wages, his long-nursed resentment finally spent like a storm that had found its horizon. The bitter grievances that had festered for 30 years seemed almost trivial now, overwhelmed by the shocking reality of what true malice could accomplish. Dr. Fleming remained in her cottage under reasonable lease terms, her clinical efficiency softening into warmer bedside manner as patients gradually overcame their initial nervousness about her medical expertise. The village itself bore invisible scars from its encounter with calculated murder. The comfortable assumptions about respectability and hidden nature had been permanently altered. Mrs. Gibbs, the postmistress, admitted with characteristic bluntness that she now paid closer attention to the correspondence she sorted, wondering what desperate secrets might be traveling through her careful hands. On the Sunday following the inquest, Reverend Ashworth had spoken of stewardship and pride beneath the ancient oak, his voice carrying along the hedgerows with weary grace. The parish gathered with more space between them, as if physical proximity might somehow reveal uncomfortable truths about their neighbours' capacity for deception. Inspector Craddock called on Miss Marple in Street, Mary Mead the following week, finding her settled by a sunny window with her knitting and late chrysanthemums. He came bearing formal thanks and lingering questions that had worried him like a persistent ache. The apricot glaze evidence was compelling, he admitted over tea, yet it might have clung to various hands. Dr. Fleming's medical knowledge seemed equally suspicious to some minds. Miss Marple's eyes brightened with gentle approval for his thoroughness. Consider the nature of both knowledge and access, Inspector. Cyanide represents planning, not impulse. Who knew where forgotten chemicals might be found among old darkroom equipment? Who could move freely through Hollow Tree Farm during the blessing ceremony, with authority to direct others elsewhere? Who maintained the household schedules, keys, and routines as precisely as ledger entries? Craddock nodded slowly. Mrs. Pembroke's organizational skills became murderous methods. Precisely, Doctor. Fleming's knowledge was scrupulous, rather than calculating. Her stillness showed medical caution, not guilt. Peter's temperament ran towards smashing rather than measuring. Owen's resentments burned visibly like weather, while we required grievances that kept careful accounts. Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. The orange stain on Mrs. Pembroke's clipboard, sugar crystals on her cuff, the tacky residue on Thomas's bureau apricot glaze touched before cooling completely. An impatient error revealing methodical preparation. Motives disguised as virtues, Craddock observed, closing his notebook. Dutiful service curdling into possessiveness, Miss Marple agreed. When Mrs. Pembroke discovered Thomas's charitable plans, she saw personal erasure rather than philanthropy. Murder often springs less from greed than from refusing to be made small. Back in Little Wickham, life resumed its essential rhythms. The hollow oak stood with ancient endurance, scrubbed of its grim secrets. New bunting appeared for Michaelmas, hung slightly lower because someone thought it kinder that way. Margaret wrote letters in steadier handwriting. Peter learned field names his father had known only by boundary markers, and Dr. Fleming tended patients with surprising gentleness. The cider press turned again, though quietly. Children played beneath the oak where poison had been hidden, their laughter gradually erasing echoes of that terrible afternoon. The village would not forget how easily familiar faces could harbor lethal calculation, but they would continue living, which is what communities do. Miss Marple returned to her roses and simple suppers in Street. Mary Mead, maintaining her accustomed watchfulness that appeared like amiable distraction until circumstances demanded otherwise. The death at Hollow Tree Farm had ended, but the wisdom gained from confronting evil in respectable clothing would endure, making the village stronger through honest recognition of human nature's darker possibilities.